Thank you for coming to our last session. It's been a really stimulating and fascinating day and a half of papers. I feel like I've already learned so much about a topic that's rarely discussed, so it's very informative. Our last panel will no doubt add to the conversation in provocative ways. Is that me? Or? I'm so pleased to introduce our last two speakers. Our first presentation is by Dr. Michele Greet. Michele Greet is Associate Professor of Modern Latin American Art at George Mason University, and she's the director of the art history program there. She's also the president of the Association for Latin American Art, or ALA. Her monograph, Transatlantic Encounters, Latin American Artists in Paris Between the Wars, 1918 to 1939, is forthcoming with Yale University Press next year in 2018. I'm looking forward to that. She is also curating a major traveling exhibition on the topic with the American Federation of the Arts, which will travel in 2019. Fortunately for the topic at hand, she is co-editor with Gina Tarver of the forthcoming anthology entitled Art Museums of Latin America, Structuring Representation, and that's coming out with Routledge Press in 2018, and so that it would be interesting to kind of reflect on this symposium through that publication. Her first book, Beyond National Identity, Pictorial Indigenism as a Modernist Strategy in Andean Art from 1920 to 1960, came out with Penn State University Press in 2009. And Michele, please come to the podium.
So thank you so much for that introduction, and I would also like to add my thanks to the organizers at the Getty and also to my fellow speakers coming in the last session. It's a little bit daunting to come after such fascinating talks. So before I begin my talk, I'd like to provide some background about the origins of the project that brought me to this conference. In the summer of 2014, I participated in the Summer Institute on Digital Humanities, sponsored by the Getty Foundation, at George Mason University. Another participant and fellow Latin Americanist, Gina Tarver, and I discovered that we had a common interest in museum history. For many years, I have taught a museum history course at GMU, and one of my biggest frustrations is the complete lack of comprehensive and quality scholarship in English, or even in Spanish or Portuguese for that matter, although in English for our students here at George Mason, on the history of Latin American art museums. Key texts, just lost my place there. Key text in the field, from Carol Duncan's foundational theoretical book, Civilizing Rituals, in 1995, to sweeping histories such as Andrew McClellan's The Art Museum from Boulay to Bilbao of 2008, are based on in-depth examinations of museums in Europe and the United States, but do not even acknowledge Latin America as a place where art museums held unique cultural significance. Rather than bemoaning the situation, Gina and I decided that we should do something about it. We proposed a session for the 2015 Latin American Studies Association Conference in Puerto Rico, which was chosen as the sponsored panel by the Visual Cultural Studies section. One of our participants, who is here today, Aleka LeBlanc, was part of that session. The session stimulated great discussion among the panelists and the audience, and we decided to turn the topic into an edited volume. And I'm showing you the working outline of that volume and who all the participants are, and I'm going to be speaking about some aspects of that volume. The volume, Art Museums of Latin America, Structuring Representation, is due to be published next year by Routledge and includes 18 essays by scholars from 7 different countries on art museums and their varied and shifting social functions in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Cuba, Mexico, Paraguay, Peru, and in the United States. I am therefore speaking to you today as one of the organizers and editors of this project, rather than a scholar with expertise on a specific art museum. I would also like to acknowledge the very important contribution of my co-editor, Gina Tarver, who wrote sections of this talk, as well as to the contributors of the individual authors, from whose research my summary derives. What I would like to do, therefore, is to present to you some of the themes and issues that emerged in selecting, organizing, and preparing the essays for this volume. And just to tell you where we stand now, half of the essays are, well, 7 of the essays are in Spanish and 1 is in Portuguese, and those are currently in translation. And then we plan to submit the final version by September 1st for publication. I will only be discussing 3 of the 5 sections for the 5 sections. For the purpose of thematic cohesiveness and feasibility, the volume focuses exclusively on self-proclaimed art museums, while acknowledging that the category art is not circumscribed. Thus, several of our case studies, especially in the section entitled Reimagining the Art Museum, push the boundaries of the museum and the very notion of art in new directions. The primary contribution of this book is its focus on history, foundational moments, and its examination of the complicated relationship between state formation, state politics, and cultural identity. Only one volume on art museums in Latin America currently exists in English. The recently published volume, Remix, Changing Conversations in Museums of the Americas from 2016. In addition to 2 book-length compilations, one in Spanish and one a collection of conference papers in Spanish and Portuguese that I'm showing you here on the screen. While extremely valuable additions to the conversation, these books focus mainly on current museum issues, not on their history. Art museums in Latin America serve varying and complex functions as nation-building institutions and instruments of state cultural politics, as foci for the promotion of Latin American modernities and modernisms, as sites of mediation between local and international, private and public interests, and as forums for the formulation of shared values, as venues for the contestation of Eurocentric notions of culture and the realization of cultural diversity rooted in multi-ethnic environments, and as projects linked to globalization, either in an attempt to preserve and develop local viewpoints against the threat of standardization based on foreign models, or to support neoliberal urban renewal and thriving global markets. By examining a cross-section of Latin American art museums, this talk presents an account of the historical circumstances of the creation of some of these institutions. Scholars have long acknowledged museums as key to the development of nation states, and we heard much about that already in this conference. National art museums, as repositories of high culture and symbols of national identity, were particularly important in Latin America, given the region's long shared history of settler colonialism and its hierarchies that positioned Americans as inferior to Europeans. Well, after independence, Latin American elites were anxious to establish their independence and cultural difference vis-à-vis Spain and Portugal. They also found it expedient to demonstrate their nation's foundation in European civilization in order to protect their own privileged position within the post-colonial social hierarchy. The fine arts of painting and sculpture were well suited to this purpose. After periods of political upheaval, art museums became places where the state could adjust its nationalist positions. For example, to take into account the demands of populism and indigenism, and even accommodate the emergence of cultural tourism. As state cultural politics changed, so too did the formulation of national art museums, which took part in ideological shifts throughout the 20th century, participating in or resisting political movements as varied as democracy, populism, socialism, communism, and totalitarianism. The first official art collections in Latin America formed in cities associated with viceregal governance and the seats of colonial authority, in Rio de Janeiro, Mexico City, and Lima. The oldest art academies in the New World, the Academia de San Carlos in Mexico City, founded in 1781, implemented and maintained an art collection that today numbers more than 65,000 objects. This collection did not reside in an official museum until 1934, however, with the establishment of the Museo de Artes Plásticas, today known as the Palacio de Bellas Artes. The core of what is today the Museo Nacional de Bellas Artes in Rio de Janeiro stems from the Portuguese royal collection that King João VI brought with him to Brazil in 1808 when fleeing invading French troops. The collection was transferred to the Royal Academy of Sciences, Arts, and Crafts upon its foundation in 1826. Both Peru and Mexico, for example, founded national museums in the early 19th century, in 1822 and 1825, respectively, as did Colombia in 1824. But these museums focused on archaeology, anthropology, and history, not the fine arts per se. While not fine arts museums, these institutions were among the earliest to be associated with the formation of nation states following the battles for independence in the region. Towards the end of the 19th century and into the early years of the 20th century, the foundation of national art museums picked up pace as a means to assert these newly formed nation status as cultured entities with distinct national characteristics. The relationship between the state and the actual contents and functions of these museums was complex, however. In Argentina, for example, at the Museo de Bellas Artes that was founded in Buenos Aires in 1896, private collectors who had a strong preference for European art shaped the core of the collection in the museum's early years. It was not until 1911, with the establishment of the National Salons, that the museum began to focus on acquiring art made by Argentinian artists. Moreover, while Argentine artists produced most of the newly acquired art after 1911, the styles and subjects represented remained deeply rooted in European aesthetic conventions for several decades. The decision whether to focus on collecting European or national art was a continual source of debate for directors. Should national art museums strive to create an encyclopedic collection, both in terms of the geography and chronology, which is expensive to finance and essentially impossible to attain? Or should these institutions focus on highlighting artistic production from within the country? The issue at stake was not just philosophical, but practical. Collecting abroad required a clearly defined agenda and a budget to support that agenda. I've got some large image files, so there it goes, okay. Mexico's Museo de Artes Plásticas adopted collecting and exhibition practices that reveal the difficulties museums face in negotiating political transitions and framing a vision of national identity that aligns with the country's cultural values. Unwilling to take a progressive stance, in 1934, the newly founded Museo de Artes Plásticas established a curatorial program that emphasized connections between the local and the European as a means to validate Mexican artistic production as part of a larger Spanish tradition. Unsure that the current penchant for artistic nationalism would consolidate into a hegemonic movement in the years following the revolution, museum officials perpetuated collecting and display strategies rooted in the past. This approach conflicted with the progressive attitude of artists and intellectuals in the post-revolutionary moment, ultimately leading to the museum's critical failure. With its refounding in 1947, the Museo de Artes Plásticas adjusted its concept of national culture, abandoning the European aesthetic canon and adopting a totally different approach, which foregrounded populist indigenous expression as a primary feature of national identity. And we heard much more extensively about this from Agustin. This new stance promoted the idea of a continuum of national art from the pre-Columbian through the colonial to the locally produced modern, in effect, a triumphal artistic canon of Mexican art. While the Museo de Artes Plásticas' presentation of national character lagged behind the political environment at the moment of its foundation, adjustments made after World War II served to align it more closely with contemporary attitudes. In addition to defining the parameters of their collections, museum founders also had to determine the image their new art museum would project to the public through its architectural design. In the case of Cuba's Museo Nacional de Bellas Artes, demonstrating ties to Cuba's architectural past was essential to creating a sense of continuity with historical precedents. Appropriating elements from colonial-style buildings was a way of honoring a moment that intellectuals in the 1920s and 1930s, frustrated with the corruption of post-independence era governments, perceived to have been morally grounded, a time when the Cuban-born elite were fighting for higher ideals and national sovereignty. Original plans for the museum, proposed between 1925 and 1951, therefore maintained the neoclassical arches of the Mercado Colón site, and I'm showing you that here, where the museum was to be built. While the building that eventually opened in 1954, and that's the slide on the right-hand side, embodied an international-style modernist aesthetic, aspects of its design still recalled colonial architectural traditions, such as its fortress-like structure and interior patio customary in Spanish colonial architecture in Old Havana. These references to the colonial past served as an acknowledgement of Cuba's unique history, while simultaneously presenting the museum, and by extension Cuban culture, as international and modern. These case studies reveal that art museums in post-colonial Latin America, especially in their early years of existence, engaged in constant self-questioning. These museums were often marked by their deficiencies: incomplete collections that were badly conserved and insufficiently studied, precarious infrastructure, and improvised museographic conditions. Were encyclopedic collections necessary to demonstrate belonging to a so-called civil society? To what degree should a connection to European trends be acknowledged? Or should each nation attempt to present its culture as distinct from that of Europe? And how exactly should that be done? Could the nation's colonial past be framed as a time of identity formation and incipient resistance to Spanish authority, and therefore important to historical continuity? Or was it necessary to reject that past, to reclaim a sense of cultural authority, authenticity and authority following independence? In the middle of the 20th century, as post-World War II American economies boomed and Latin American nations sought more prominent positions in world markets, new art museums emerged as symbols of modernity. Stimulated by, just move on to the next slide there. Stimulated by the dominant governmental economic policy of developmentalism, modernization led to an increased focus on an international modernism in the cultural realm, based largely on European models. Many modern art museums fulfilled this role primarily through their monumental architectural presence in urban centers. Dozens of modern museum buildings were constructed between the late 1940s and the 1970s in cities throughout Latin America. Latin American architects designed international-style buildings that stressed openness, flexibility, and functionalism, believing the buildings themselves to be structures essential to fostering the new visions promoted by modernism. In contrast, some museum planners realized that within their country, it was impossible to structure the modern art museum the same way in more economically than in more economically prosperous nations. They therefore channeled their efforts into building social networks rather than constructing new edifices, sometimes even creating their modern museums without buildings until permanent premises could be established. In Brazil alone, this modern moment manifested in the foundation of 3 art museums, and I'm showing you them here, 2 with an exclusive emphasis on modern art in quick succession. The Museo de Arte de São Paulo, established in 1947, the Museo de Arte Moderno de São Paulo, established in 1948, and the Museo de Arte Moderno de Rio de Janeiro, established in 1948 and built in 1955. These new museums lacked collections and the funds to create them, despite what art critic and then later director of MAM Sao Paulo, from Mario Pedrosa, described as, quote, the patriotic and superhuman effort of their directors, end quote. In the face of these museums' inability to acquire encyclopedic collections, Pedrosa proposes an innovative solution, calling for a museum of copies, to be founded in the new capital city of Brasilia. Oops. And this is just for visuals here. His proposal, which he articulated in letters to architect Oscar Niemeyer between 1956 and 1960, presents a museum with no original works that would contain only photographic reproductions, models and casts of sculptures, and plans. In Pedrosa's postmodernist concept of a museum, the original object would no longer matter, and the constructed experience of totality and universality would replace the emphasis on authenticity and uniqueness. It was the museum itself and the experience it would provide that was original, not its content. The emphasis would be on education of both the public and aspiring artists, and through synthesis and access, would inspire new movements to develop in Brazil. While this proposal was never executed, there is no museum of copies in Brasilia, or was it even seriously considered, it demonstrates the philosophical turn museum formation had taken in Latin America, and the creative solutions proposed to address the lack of funds and infrastructure. In other instances, museums challenged assumptions about the necessary link between architecture, specifically purpose-built modern structures, and the construct of a museum. The Museo de Arte Moderno in Bogotá, for example, functioned for 15 years without a designated permanent exhibition space, running out of a commercial center, a university, and even a planetarium before finally obtaining a permanent structure in 1979. This lack of an architectural home did not undermine the museum's legitimacy, however. During its transient period, the museum negotiated a fragile relationship with various governments, asserting the importance of artists as social actors and their role in defining art and its institutions. The Museo de Arte Moderno Bogotá also asserted its importance as an educational center, which, like Pedrosa's proposal for a museum of copies, sought to define its social value through the promotion of a metropolitan culture in which all citizens could partake. There it goes. Whereas the Museo de Arte Moderno in Bogotá was fully functional as a museum before its building was constructed, the Museo de Arte Moderno in Mexico City established its identity as a modern institution precisely because of its architecture. At its opening in 1964, the museum did not have a significant collection, and again, we've heard about this from Agustin, nor did it propose a novel curatorial platform. Rather, it was the new building, designed by architect Pedro Ramirez Vázquez, with its curved glass walls and interconnecting circular exhibition halls with movable partitions intended to adapt and change as the collection grew, that was innovative. Emulating the sleek glass structures housing commercial and administrative ventures, the museum aligned with a vision of the future, distinguishing itself from the Beaux-Arts designs of Mexico City's older museums. The Museo de Arte Moderno was part of a circuit of museums built in the Bosque de Chapultepec, which included a museum of natural history and a museum of anthropology, and the other museums, again, that Agustin discussed earlier. The addition of a modern art museum to this complex signaled an attempt on the part of the Mexican government to project the country's modernity and progress. And again, all of this is in the wake of the 1968 Olympics. Whereas the ultramodern space could accommodate experimental exhibitions, in its early years, the museum's exhibition programming presented a narrative of continuity in Mexican art that did not match the level of originality the new building signaled. It was thus the building itself that created the impulse for change and established the museum's modernity. Cultural revolutions and political unrest throughout the hemisphere in the late 1960s led to increasing pressure on art museums to become more inclusive spaces. Inclusivity was a major theme of much of the new museology that had deeply impacted the museum sector in the past 3 decades. The participation of Latin American museums in the development of new museological approaches, which can be traced back to the early 20th century, has been much overlooked, however. In Mexico, as early as the 1920s, a group of artists, by way of a call put out in a magazine, wrote a proposal for a new approach to an art museum. These artists sought to create an institution that would challenge Eurocentric and elitist definitions of art in order to encompass Mexico's rich and varied cultural heritage. So we're, in this volume, we're looking at proposals as well as actually established museums. As elsewhere in the world, the idea of a non-elite museum, one that makes space for the wide sectors of population, has been gaining momentum in Latin America since the 1970s. This stance was articulated officially in 1972 at the UNESCO-sponsored meeting of museums in Santiago de Chile, where the central question was how best to serve the multi-ethnic populations of Latin American countries. In recent decades, revisions to existing institutions or new kinds of museums that respond to precarious socioeconomic realities and previously overlooked publics have emerged in countries as varied as Chile, Paraguay, and Peru, offering alternative museum models. In Chile, a museum that has long been an example of staid traditionalism, the Museo Nacional de Bellas Artes de Santiago, founded in 1880 and relocated to its current building in 1910, that's the building that I'm showing you here, although a current slide, underwent a major transformation in the years between 1969 and 1973, when it came under the direction of artist Santiago de Nemesio Antunes. Leading up to and in the context of Salvador Allende's Unidad Popular, which inspired multiple projects for social change. Antunes rethought the museum and its role in society, implementing several significant changes to its structure and programming. He remodeled the space to create room for the exhibition of contemporary art and focused on education and inclusivity, creating a vibrant and living community museum. To do so, he featured young artists whose work was experimental and conceptual, such as Luis Kamnitzer, Liliana Porter, and Juan Pablo Langlois. Langlois, for example, created an installation for the museum that consisted of 200 meters of garbage bags filled with newspaper in the form of a long tube that wound up the stairs, through the second floor, and out a window. This sort of ephemeral and movable art called attention to the precarious condition of the object and the museum as institution. Furthermore, Antunes reorganized the collection to emphasize indigenous and popular art and featured prominently contemporary Latin American artists. This shift in programming and emphasis on inclusivity attracted triple the number of visitors in 1970 than in the previous years. Unfortunately, Antunes' attempt to create a museum that would play a role in social development and would be relevant to the local community came to abrupt halt with the military coup in 1973. Similarly, the Museo del Barro in Paraguay, formed by a group of artists and intellectuals in response to the repressive political environment in the 1970s, proposed a new museum model that interrogated the museum institution from the local standpoint. The Museo del Barro resulted from the confluence of three independent projects: a pottery collection, an indigenous art collection, and a collection of contemporary art. The foundation of a museum based on objects outside the mainstream of the so-called fine arts that represented the creative output of local populations served as a political act, a means of asserting the voices of the repressed and ignored in Paraguayan culture. For several years, the collection circulated to areas of Asunción and its outskirts without access to cultural projects. And even after it moved into a more permanent building in 1983, the museum and its programs shifted and expanded constantly to incorporate its multiple moving parts. Another museum that brought to light censored voices, in this case under the Fujimori regime in Peru, was Lima's Micromuseo. Formed by a group of artists and curator Gustavo Buntings, the Micromuseo positioned itself as an alternative to the Lima Biennial in 1995, holding its first exhibition in an abandoned house. The museum remained a nomadic project, exhibiting in empty buildings, cemeteries, poor neighborhoods, and even in the streets to fill the museological vacuum in Lima. According to Buntings, and I'm quoting here, "A museum is not a building, but rather a collection and a critical project. It is not a location, but rather a social, cultural, and civic space," end quote. This itinerant museum challenged the unidirectional flow of information from the elites to the city center to the outskirts, and instead allowed the populace to shape the space of the museum. This type of museum aims to erase the boundaries between art and society and disrupt the classification of art as separate from other forms of cultural production. Close analyses of Latin American art museums reveal the unique challenges and perspectives that emerge in distinct national contexts. Yet these museums also share a hemispheric quest to establish distinct modern identities and to address their particular local and national audiences. Art museums in Latin America often shift their focus away from the collection and preservation of hallowed objects to instead emphasize political activism, education, inclusivity, and supporting local artisans. Studying these museums facilitates not only an account of the historical circumstances of the creation of these institutions, but also a broadening of the assumptions and theoretical frameworks deployed in the museum studies discipline. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michele, for a very provocative summary. And I would like to introduce now Professor Ondine Chavoya, who adds a different dimension to this conversation. Ondine Chavoya is Professor of Art History and Latino Studies with the W. Ford Schumann Faculty Fellow in Democratic Studies, which sounds very important. and a faculty fellow of the Davis Center and the Office of Institutional Diversity and Equity at Williams College, where he teaches courses on contemporary art and visual culture. Recent curatorial projects include OSCO, Elite of the Obscure, a retrospective, 1972 to 1987, from the last PST in Los Angeles, and Robert Rauschenberg, an autobiography, a collaboration with the Rauschenberg Foundation and Archive, currently on view at the Williams College of Art through August 20th, 2017. For the PST2 project, he's co-organizing the exhibit Axis Mundo, the queer networks in Chicano, LA, with the One National Gay and Lesbian Archives that will open at the MoCA Pacific Design Center and One Gallery West Hollywood in the fall of 2017. Welcome, Ondine.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased, so honored to be here and to participate in this remarkable discussion. And so my thanks to Tomas and to Jennifer and to Marissa for all the work in organizing this. And a very special thanks to Elena, Aleka, and Kim, not just for your work in organizing this, but for really helping to kind of for me at least, help to make the GRI a much more kind of dynamic space for these types of conversations. So thank you so much. I took an alternative route myself as I was preparing this paper. So in the first part of my paper, I will highlight, and I should probably go to. That's what I need to do. Thank you. I will highlight shared issues between forms of Latin American and US Latino art that were not necessarily or primarily made for museums or museum collections, although they have on occasion wound up there. And in the light of the conversation yesterday, I decided to take an alternative path. And so the second part of my paper is completely new, and in an effort to introduce the birth of the museum in Latino America to this important conversation. Because I'm afraid, quite honestly, that if I don't, it might otherwise, a discussion about Latino museums within the United States might not otherwise be discussed, and I would be remiss not to introduce that myself. So I'll start with the first part that focuses on mail art, and what I'm showing you here. The first part of my presentation focuses on mail art, also known as correspondence art, arte correo, or arte postal, largely from the 1970s in Latin American and US Latino contexts. And what you're seeing here is a work sent by the Chicano, Los Angeles-based artist Teddy Sandoval to a San Francisco artist, Bill Gaglione, that was then forwarded to Art Metropole in Toronto and currently exists in the National Galleries of Canada. As a model of art making and distribution based on communication and exchange, mail art was international in scope and designed to be traded freely and was often developed collaboratively or cumulatively. And here is another example of works by an Argentine artist, Vigo, that he sent to a Mexican conceptualist, Ulises Carrion, living in Amsterdam, that found its way to UC San Diego. The idiosyncratic method of transmission and production facilitated all sorts of experimental and ephemeral forms, including postcards, rubber stamps, collage, Xerox art, and multiple variations on artist books, including assembling magazines and zines, which, as Schiffer Goldman suggested, were all translated to Latin America and politicized. The patterns of communication and exchange were often described as a network by participating artists. This correspondence art network was a loosely configured international constellation of artists producing and exchanging products by mail. And here I'm showing you two works by Carrion with rubber stamps that were found in Iowa City. And I'll talk more about Iowa in a little bit. For participants, what was perhaps most valued was its democratic and participatory character. First begun in the late 1950s, the network had become global by the early 1970s and was often lauded as an alternative, non-elitist, democratic method for the production and distribution of art. This was a time when many artists were seeking to create or continue to foster alternative art movements in spaces that would be radically social and interactive, intermedial, and performative. Correspondence art allowed for artists to communicate directly with one another, effectively creating both a forum and a form for art production. This collective communication signaled the possibility of circumventing the commercial art systems and involved a rejection of the use of the artwork as a commodity to be exchanged on the art market and through its affiliated institutions. As a result of these practices, variously described as decentralized, ephemeral, or fugitive, they've generally bypassed museums. And so here, this is a work by Osco, also found in Iowa, and two postcards by the LA-based artist Joey Terrell, Chicano artist Joey Terrell, also found in Iowa. And although they have largely evaded commercial and museum circuits, as Cristina Freire, curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art of the University of Sao Paulo, recently pointed out, this is a situation that is rapidly changing. Distribution was a chief concern for these practices. So how have these dispersed models of circulation and exchange and the emphasis on distribution impacted both collecting and research practices? Especially seen as how I mentioned earlier, so many of these works were not necessarily bound for museums and were generally produced to bypass commercial art networks and museum contexts. Collections today are found primarily in libraries and archives, including museum libraries and archives associated with alternative artist spaces, but they're also now to be found in private collections and more informal archives, meaning people's individual personal collections in homes. So if the work was made to be distributed, mailed, or otherwise exchanged, the historian and the curator has to find where it was sent and where it might have ended up. And as you follow the circuitous routes of mail art activities, collections of this type of work by Latin American and Latino artists may appear in very unexpected places. Correspondence art enabled both the creation and participation, and in many ways provided the conditions for productions for artists operated in isolation or in remote locations outside of artistic centers. In effect, the ethos of shared creation and linked connection across distance among a network of friends, acquaintances, and strangers allowed the participants to carry out a variety of new ideas and practices. And here I'm showing you a variety of Osco No movies sent by the artist Gronk to Robert Lambert. Importantly, as art historian Paulina Varos Alarcón contends, the people who created the mail art network often did not know each other personally, but nevertheless established an intense and emotional relationship based on the presence and absence of their bodies. For Chicano artists like Osco and Teddy Sandoval, correspondence art, the child of the textual maneuvers of conceptual art and the restless, gregarious energies of fluxus, enabled them to operate along that, or operate within and through this mesh of interconnections that were both immediate and remote, that according to the performance artist Guillermo Gomez Peña, are the very networks that put pan-Latin Americanism in touch with the Chicano movement and put both of these in touch with other international vanguards. Many of the works I've shown you were found in the alternative traditions in the Contemporary Arts Collection at the University of Iowa Library's Special Collections in Iowa City. Here are some more of I'm behind on my slides, forgive me, but these are works by Teddy Sandoval from his performance with Gronk, La Historia de Frida Kahlo, that you can see the ways that Robert Lambert is kind of going through his personal archive, the way that they were mailed to him as mail art, and the ways in which we were now able to present them, and we'll show them in our upcoming exhibition. Other Teddy Sandoval-related mail art pieces that hadn't been seen or identified before that were found in kind of dispersed archives, both personal and institutional, across the United States as we pursued this research, thanks to the support of the Getty. But many of these works, including this work on the left by Paolo Bruschi and on the right by Horacio Zavala, the Latin American artist, came from the University of Iowa Libraries and Special Collections. And this is the Alternative Traditions in Contemporary Art, or ATCA collection, which is committed to the collection and preservation of works by contemporary artists, generally focused in the post-World War II avant-garde. As of 1997, the numbers haven't quite been updated, it contained over over 5,000 items, and it's composed of artifacts spanning phenomena such as fluxus, happenings, bookworks, and visual poetry, artist videos, conceptual and correspondence art, as well as performance relics. It's primarily known for its Fluxus collection, but it also houses a significant collection of materials related to US Latino, Latina, and Latin American male art and correspondence. And these are connections that have been largely unexplored, and this collection contains enough material for several additional exhibitions. It also houses an entire historical exhibition from Kayak. So it has the only known edition of the Hacia un perfil de arte Latinoamérica, Americo, which was an international exhibition organized by Jorge Glusberg, director of Kayak in Buenos Aires. And it was first exhibited in Medellin in Colombia in May 1972, and then it was subsequently enlarged to 148 works. It was presented in Buenos Aires, Pamplona, Madrid, Warsaw, Reykjavik, Quito, Panama, and Cali. And then in the US, it traveled to the University of Virginia and the Oberlin College of Art. Originally, the exhibition circulated in an edition of 10, and the only known surviving edition is in Iowa, and I couldn't tell you how it got there. They can't either. The ADCA collection was founded in 1979 as a special collections program in the University of Iowa's libraries. Its base of operations then shifted to the School of Art and Art History in 1982, and then again in 1994 to the Museum of Art. It's now back in the library's special collections. It seems to have been orphaned or abandoned by the museum. This likely coincided with or happened in the aftermath of the devastating 2008 floods that displaced the entire collection. ADCA is a collection of collections. It houses the collections of male artists such as Buster Cleveland, Steve Derland, Fluxus West, Ken Friedman, Bill Gaglione, a small Dick Higgins collection, E.F. Higgins, Alice Hutchins, and Zach Trenholm, who was Buster Cleveland's son, among many others. It also houses the Artwords and Bookworks collection, a huge artist, periodical, and zines collection in 1978 that was an exhibition here at LICA, the Los Angeles Institute of Contemporary Art, a sprawling exhibition focusing on artists' multiples and publications with over 600 objects and 600 artists and 1,500 objects that was organized by Judith Hofberg and Joan Hugo, who was a head librarian at the Otis Art Institute. But aside from Kayak, none of these collections are specifically related to US Latino or Latin American art or artists, but it's the grouping of figures who were in correspondence with artists from Latin America and with Latino and Chicano artists that makes it such a rich collection. And through the course of my research, I've also found another entire exhibition from Latin America that can be found in an archive here locally, and that is for the exhibition America en la Mira, and is now currently, well, that's how it currently exists at the Chicano Studies Research Center in its archival condition in Los Angeles. The exhibition America en la Mira, which can be translated as either America in the Viewfinder or Target America, which was organized by the Frente Mexicano de Grupos Trabajadores de la Cultura in Mexico, and developed from an open call for experimental graphics on the theme of America in a continental sense. Participants were requested to submit 3 copies of the same work, measuring no more than 16 by 24 inches, so that the show could be installed in 3 different venues at the same time. And here you have 2 examples, one again by Zavala, and the one on the right by Grupos Mira out of Mexico. In this way, the exhibition could multiply the multiple. The show collected works by artists and artist groups from Argentina, Belgium, Brazil, Canada, Chile, although in exile, Colombia, Czechoslovakia, East and West Germany, France, Hungary, Italy, Mexico, the Netherlands, Spain, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, and the United States. America en la Mira traveled to more than 9 different Mexican cities before concluding in Los Angeles, where it opened at LACE, Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions, in September 1979. And it was on view at the same time as Testimonios de Latinoamérica, organized by Felipe Ehrenberg. Apparently, however, the show America en la Mira never made it back, and at some point landed at UCLA, where it has been preserved as part of the Chicano Studies Research Center archival collections. And here's one more piece that I want to show you. So it's a Lawrence Werner, right, with a Vigo as well. So kind of interesting confluence of materials. Through their participation in this exchange network, individual artists began to amass massive personal archives, creating what Freire has described as a dialectic among museum, library, home, and archives. And these collections are sometimes and often precarious, like the lives of so many artists, particularly those who operate outside of explicitly commercial markets. Clemente Padin, the Uruguayan artist, organized the first documented male art exhibition in Latin America in 1974, 1 year into the Uruguayan military dictatorship, and it was titled the Festival del Postal Creativa. He was a central figure in the visual, poetry, and mail art networks in Latin America, as well as internationally, known for his work as an artist, curator, editor, and theoretician. Padin began his personal collection of visual poetry in 1967. His publications Ovum and Ovum 10, published between 1969 to 1974, established the prototype of the Latin American Network magazine. And the archive of Uruguayan artist Clemente Padin is also exemplary of the turbulent period in which as an artist, he lived in and the kind of vulnerability of these archives that I want to bring attention to. As Padin is described, he said, I lost my files twice. The first time was in 1973, 1 year before I had exhibited in Montevideo works by more than 400 experimental poets in an exhaustive international new exhibition. In 1973, I packed the entire collection for an exhibition at the Fine Arts Museum of Santiago in Chile and delivered it to the Chilean Council in Uruguay. The Chilean coup d'etat occurred the very next week. And as Padin explains, quote, I couldn't go to the embassy to get back the 10 boxes containing all the works, so I ended up losing all my visual poetry archive, close quote. As he became more and more involved in correspondence art in 1974, he amassed a sizable collection, and he was in contact with Gronk, Harry Gamboa, a large number of artists here in Los Angeles. This collection was also lost when he was arrested and imprisoned by the military dictatorship of Uruguay for his activities as an artist in 1977. The loss of personal archives and mail art collections with significant Latin American and US Latina and Latino materials also occurred in the United States. And here I just want to introduce briefly the figure of Jerry Driva, close collaborator with Gronk and other artists here in Los Angeles, worked for a short period of time at Leica as well, who also amassed a massive archive, a major kind of correspondence a network person, part of a two-person show with Gronk at Lace in 1978, someone who I've been trying to kind of piece together materials on for many years now. In 1995, Jerry Driva wrote former Art in America editor Howard Singerman, curious news, this is going to sound strange, but it's curious news about me, Ondine Chavoya. It might be fun digging out archives and reevaluating all that stuff. I often wondered just what I was doing then and where it might have led. I've got boxes of early 1974 to 1978 Gronk letters, drawings, plus bonbon files. Sure, give Ondine my address. I don't know how to explain those years to my Maoist friends. Singerman closed his letter encouraging me to pursue the research, saying he keeps amazing records and someone should know about him. I was a graduate student in Rochester, New York at the time, and I was living, I can say that in quotes, on an annual stipend of $5,000 a year. So that's the living, right? And unable to secure the funding to make the research trip. In 1997, I sent a packet of materials to the Smithsonian Archives of American Art, asking them to pursue acquiring Driva's archive. And I've since learned that I wasn't the only person pursuing such endeavors at the time. Also in 1997, shortly after a brief visit to Los Angeles and a reunion with Harry Gamboa and Gronk, Jerry Driva died in South Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Later that year, while browsing the Bound and Bound artist bookstore in Manhattan, I was introduced to Stephen Lieber, the San Francisco dealer and collector who specialized in conceptual art, mail art, and related ephemera. And he informed me that soon after Jerry Driva's death, his relatives sold all of Driva's personal effects at a garage sale. And what didn't sell was carted off to the South Milwaukee Municipal Dump. So that's a little bit about the precariousness and vulnerability of these archives. And I want to shift now in a really radical, like unelegant way, to discuss a little bit about, in the time that I have remaining, about Latina and Latino museums in the United States. And when you think of such institutions, I hope you will think of institutions like El Museo del Barrio, you might think of the Mexican Fine Arts Center in Chicago, or the National Hispanic Cultural Center in Albuquerque, each representing kind of different models with different origins. El Museo del Barrio was founded in 1969 in New York's Manhattan, dedicated to presenting and preserving the art and culture of Puerto Ricans and all Latin Americans in the United States. And it comes out of an activist, neighborhood, and avant-garde history with its founder and artist, Rafael Montañez Ortiz. The Mexican Fine Arts Center in Chicago is today the largest museum in the US dedicated to Latino art. It was founded by educators and teachers in 1982 to provide art education classes and to assist artists. And it moved to its kind of permanent place in Pilsen in 1987. The National Hispanic Cultural Center in Albuquerque opened in 2000 as part of the New Mexico State Department of Cultural Affairs. So it's a state institution in the role of a default national organization or museum where we don't really have one. And this afternoon, in the time remaining, I want to highlight these kind of earlier artist initiative models of museums in California that are more aligned with the origins of El Museo del Barrio. And just to kind of point out that in 1974, with the group show of Los Four at the LA County Museum of Art, this became the first exhibition of Chicano art in a public museum. The show garnered unprecedented media coverage, including a review and art forum by noted critic Peter Plagins, who skeptically asked if the group of artists in the exhibition represented a Chicano aesthetic. He was fundamentally concerned, and I think this is where art criticism with regards to questions of Chicano art is still stuck, with questions of authenticity. And to this effect, he asked whether the art and artists at LACMA have the capacity to Chicanoize the museum, or if the inclusion of Los Four can only function to museumify the Chicanos. But these questions of these are kind of the critical and foundational questions that were posed by art critics like William Wilson, writing the LA Times, or Alfred Frankenstein, writing the San Francisco Chronicle, and this kind of ongoing kind of obsession with these questions of inclusion and authenticity. Where does Chicano art belong? What's its proper context? Is there an appropriate method for its interpretation and means of evaluation? And importantly, how should it be exhibited, collected, and interpreted by museums and other civic educational institutions? And this is complicated by the fact that from the onset, Chicano art was largely defined in relationship to institutions and to institutionalization, which is to say, from the onset, it was defined outside of or in opposition to the museum. In 1969, Los Artistas de Aztlán proclaimed, "We refuse to exhibit our work in gringo institutions and galleries." And indeed, one of the original ideals of the Chicano art movement was to work outside of the traditional fine arts institutions and commercial venues. As Philip Brookman characterized this scenario writing in 1991, Chicano artists worked to redefine their relative engagement with society and with the hegemony of mainstream cultural practices and institutions. They created their own institutions rather than accept exclusion. Close quote. And there are numerous examples of just this that emerged. Beginning in the late 1960s, a growing number of arts institutions, organizations, and artist-run spaces emerged in a kind of very far-reaching kind of areas across the country. And I provide you a list here that begins at about 1969 at the top, 1968 actually, and continues through 1976. So we have Grito de Aztlán Gallery in Denver, Goa's Art Gallery here in Los Angeles, Mexicano in Los Angeles, Plaza de la Raza in Los Angeles. You can see Los Angeles was a hub. Galería de la Raza in San Francisco, Centro Cultural de la Raza in San Diego, Self-Help Graphics and Art, still to this day here in Los Angeles, in Boyle Heights, Centro de Artistas Chicanos in Sacramento, March Movimiento Artístico Chicano in Chicago, Southwest Chicano Art Center in Houston, the Mexican Museum in San Francisco, Xochitl Art and Culture Center in Mission, Texas, Spark in Venice, California, led by Judy Baca, the Chicano Humanities Arts Council Gallery and Cultural Center in Denver, the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center in San Antonio, and Mars in Phoenix, Arizona. All of these institutions and the many others like them worked from the ground up and supported Chicano art, artists, and communities before more mainstream institutions began mounting exhibitions on Chicano art. What's interesting about this grouping of organizations and institutions is that they emerge out of a different history and in counter-distinction to many of the institutions and museums we've heard about over the course of the symposium. The origins of the Chicano and Latino museums in the late 1960s can be found with artists and artist collectives and the establishment of cultural centers and alternative art spaces by members of these artist collectives. These artist collectives developed various models of critique and organization, and the centros they established helped to foster and create different means and modes of production and circulation. They sought to develop autonomous spaces and new democratic practices that challenged the state, market, and art world elite. These activist artists, activist collectives created and built new institutions as alternatives to the established institutions from which they had been historically excluded. And the vision for these new institutions, even when focused on art and artists, are modeled on cultural centers, or what Karen Mary Davalos calls the community-based advocacy and service organizations that served as a social background for Mexican and Mexican-American communities, the types of centers that flourished during the Chicano social movements in the late 1960s. And there's a lot of this generates out of San Francisco, particularly with an organization called the Malefe, a group of artists that, although they didn't have a space, they started putting together exhibitions, and many of the members of this group then went on to form other organizations like the Galería de la Raza, which was founded in 1970 by a group of Chicano and Latino artists in San Francisco and initially funded by the Neighborhood Arts Program, and became one of the first galleries available to Chicano artists in California and the Southwest more broadly, we can say. In its formative years, it was co-directed by artists René Yanez and Ralph Maradiaga, who shared its kind of artistic and administrative duties. Yanez is a conceptual artist and had a unique and I believe particularly effective and provocative way of describing the mission and the vision of this institution. For example, when he was asked about his medium, he responded, "My medium is the future. I contribute to and shape the future. My medium is working with other artists." And he would later describe the mission of the Galería de la Raza by emphasizing, "We're not here to sell our art, but to sell the idea of art." And still, he's very quotable, "We are creating the network for the working class audience among a non-elite populace." And I think that resonates really quite well with some of the kind of propositions that you were discussing, Michelle, right? So it's quite nice. By 1990, 20 years into its history, Galería de la Raza would be recognized as one of the West Coast's most enduring and influential alternative art spaces. In 1969, 2 Chicano art galleries opened in Los Angeles. I'll only speak about one. There was Goes Art Gallery and Mexicano Art Gallery, which I'll speak about briefly. Mexicano was founded by Leonard Castellanos and Victor Franco, and originally they opened in the heart of West Los Angeles' Gallery Row on Melrose Avenue, 1 block east of La Cienega Boulevard. But success as a commercial gallery was difficult and, shall we say, short-lived. So in 1970, within a year, they moved to Whittier Boulevard in East LA and transitioned from a for-profit to a not-for-profit cooperative gallery and coordinating center for local Chicana and Chicano artists. It was described by its founders as a social concept with community-oriented goals. Mexicano sought to give social and economic recognition to Chicano artists and to act as a locus for the avant-garde of Chicano art. It transformed a former laundromat into a gallery and a studio workshop and offered classes in drawing, painting, photography, music, and silk screening. In 1976, the organization faced financial difficulties and for a short-lived period operated as a mobile concept without a secure space. Through the support of an NEA expansion grant to support its silkscreen workshop and to continue its ambitious mural program in the Ramona Gardens housing project, Mexicano relocated to Highland Park later in 1976, but closed its doors soon after. Peter Rodriguez was one of the co-founding artists of Galería de la Raza, who went on to create the Mexican Museum in San Francisco. The museum was first conceptualized in 1971, although the first exhibitions were held out of his living room. In 1975 is considered its formal opening when it moved into a converted warehouse space on Folsom Street near the Mission District. According to Rodriguez, quote, "It was founded in the barrio to deal with the cultural needs of the immediate community and to introduce the important culture of Mexico and Chicanos," close quote. From the onset, it had a dual transnational mission with its focus on Mexican and Chicano art. For instance, I'll talk about this in a second. For instance, the museum's mission statement from 1992 asserts, quote, "The mission of the Mexican Museum is to collect, conserve, exhibit, and interpret the visual works of art created by Mexican people on both sides of the border in order to promote public recognition of their unique artistic and cultural contributions to American society." Unfortunately, and for those of you who know San Francisco and know this particular plot of land near SF MoMA, the Yerba Buena Center, the St. Regis Hotel, the Four Seasons, the Westin, the Contemporary Jewish Museum, and the Filipino Church, you know that the museum has been without a home since 2006. And I couldn't help but, so this reminded me, I think Raphael, it's the slide that someone showed the slide of anyway, I couldn't help but show this one. Okay, because there's a certain kind of formal resonance there with these kind of commemorations for institutions that don't, or kind of celebrations for institutions that don't yet exist, right? And this is the final group I'll discuss, another group of artists in Sacramento who originally took the name the Rebel Chicano Art Front, or RCAF, and because people confused it with the Royal Canadian Air Force, they decided to become the Royal Chicano Air Force. And they established the Centro de Artistas Chicanos in 1972 as a graphic arts and cultural center that would also function as a social services organization. Originally, it was just an artist group, Jose Montoya explained, and many members were so politically active that they didn't have time for their art. The group expanded to include dancers, musicians, poets, filmmakers, social workers, community activists, teachers, students, and scholars from various fields, including history, sociology, and anthropology. And they began producing, quote, what they described as cultural fairs and cultural events. With an expanded membership of 30, the group applied for nonprofit tax-exempt status, and a funding proposal was submitted to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors for city and county funds. Approved in 1973, the Centro incorporated into a nonprofit public service corporation. The mission of the Centro was both educational and activist, and its mandate was to maintain, safeguard, and proliferate the artistic and cultural traditions of the Mexicano/Chicano people of Sacramento and Aztlán. And although they may not have had a kiddie pool or a barber shop like El Museo Nacional de Arte, they did have a very successful Breakfast para Niños program and a remarkable auto mechanics training program and shop, which in the official article of incorporation, acting director Juan Carrillo, Joe Serna, and Esteban Villa declared that the mission of the Centro de Artistas Chicanos was, quote, to encourage, develop, and retain the creative arts of Sacramento's Spanish-speaking community, to coordinate the efforts of Chicano artists, to enhance the artistic skills of individuals, to carry on informational and educational activities for the general public in regard to Chicano cultural heritage and contemporary creative achievements, close quote. The founders asserted that the Centro would fill a need which had been absent in Sacramento, and that is the expression of Chicano culture through art. And today, the Centro de Artistas Chicanos operates as the Latino Center of Art and Culture in Sacramento. So there are many more institutions I could consider here, including Self-Help Graphics in Los Angeles, the Centro Cultural de la Raza in San Diego, and I encourage you, if you are interested in these histories, to consult the robust archival collections in the California Ethnic and Multicultural Archives at UC Santa Barbara, which houses the institutional archives for Galería de la Raza, Self-Help Graphics, the Centro Cultural de la Raza, and and one other one. Forgive me, okay. But at the very least, what I wanted to do was provide some examples of museums and institutions that are developed directly out of or in concert with social activism, that are led by artists and artist activations to transform the model and to generate new models of museums that are in dialogue with the past, but mindful of its elisions and exclusions, and work from the bottom up to do so. And I think it's important to note these inspiring histories of artists and communities navigating exclusion and charting new paths to rethink and experiment with museological models and methods. Thank you so much.
I want to make very brilliant synthetic comments, but I'm afraid I can't read my handwriting. And I think they're somewhere there, but I'll try to articulate some other, maybe not so brilliant. I really appreciated both of your talks and the kind of synthetic nature of these different institutions. I think it brings a lot of today's topics into the foreground and allows us to think on a kind of broader, maybe thematic level of the similarities and differences. I think one of the things that I've gotten out of today and yesterday's conversations is the kind of fragmented nature of museums and collections, the sort of transient, fluid, and often improvised nature of these institutions, and contrary to any idea of a stable entity. And I was, thinking about something you pointed out Gustavo Buntic said, which was the quote that a museum is not a building, but rather a collection and a critical project. So thinking about that, and then thinking about Ondine's presentation as sort of modeling that for us through these different cultural centers. And it seems to me so related, and I'm wondering if you sort of felt that as you've heard each other, and if you wanted to comment more.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think that one of the things, when we started out working on this volume is we had certain stereotypes or preconception. I mean, a museum is a building, and it's an architectural space. It involves a collection, it involves preservation. I mean, these are all the standard ideas we have. And as we started assessing these histories and these essays that we were looking at, we realized that absolutely, I mean, the question of fragmentation, the question of building, I mean, all of these things were up in the air and were not necessarily the defining factors of what a museum is. And we hoped by looking at these essays was to say, well, let's open up that conversation, and instead of keeping those limits on the building, on the space, on those traditional kind of categories, think about the unique strategies and different perspectives that museums took to address these issues.
Yeah, no, to be perfectly honest, I internalized this thought. I thought, God, it must only be the Chicano and Chicano institutions where we have to improvise all the time, right? And that we're always kind of operating in this like punk rock kind of do-it-yourself kind of way. And yet this theme of impermanence, right, and ephemerality and the necessity, right, the critical necessity to improvise, right, and to develop new museological strategies from the local perspective, I think is something that's really struck me as a really important point of connection and correspondence that I wasn't expecting, right, before these 2 days. And very
it's actually been so interesting to hear these kind of two in parallel. I was also thinking about the sort of breakdown of the nation state that a lot of the speakers discussed. And then how, in Chicano art and Latino art, we have this model for a non-national but identity-based. And so this kind of different model that we can think about as a version of, a new moving forward, right, with collections and what that could do, or what kinds of research avenues and, display possibilities that could enact.
Right. Because in that regard, I do think that, this is where, I think of Chicana and Chicano culture as like the most imagined of imagined communities, right? Because there is no nation state, right? There's no, I mean, unless you go to Chicano Park, right? And you can see the outline of the map there.
Well, and it, for PST2 or PST-LALA, there was sort of an important push to include Latino art and have that be in conversation with Latin American art. And I think today we have this model of how that happens in a really productive way. And I can, sort of keep the table going for the next half hour, but I feel that I should not be so jealous with the speakers and open it up. So, yeah.
it was just to touch a comment on this particular discussion, because over lunch we were having a debate about how can these identity politics that come from a state or a nation be successful. So, for example, we were comparing Mexico with Brazil, where Brazil you don't have this sort of articulation of a national identity, where in Mexico that is more established and accepted. And so that was sort of nice to hear this conversation, almost like a continuation. But I was actually curious, question for Ondine. Here we are, as a curator who created a wonderful exhibition, important and successful exhibition for PST1 with ASCO, and now doing another one for PST LA. I kept thinking during your presentation right now, what are your thoughts and how do you feel about PST LA and sort of this emphasis on Latino or this inclusion of Latino art? What does it mean in terms of the institutionalization of Latino, Latinx, Latina, Chicano, etc. art, when they were specifically trying to resist that, but now we are increasingly in this sort of maybe now phase of institutionalization, which is a good thing. So it's maybe not so precarious, and we have these records and archives are maintained. And as we also at the GRI, we've learned that, the sort of one of the great things to emerge from PST1 was that all these archives are preserved, and there's this great push. I mean, I keep hearing from my colleagues that we are getting more and more archives, and I'm sure this will result in the same way with Latino art. But is there sort of also like an unease to this process, and what does that feel like and mean for you as a curator participating in this? And but maybe there is sort of a tension there as well.
I think one of the critical questions, and there are several, but one of them has to do with collecting and who's doing the collecting, where the collecting is happening. And it's so true. The archival collections, I mean, there could not have been a Chicano art history without the initiatives of university librarians, fundamentally. I mean, it was Roberto Trujillo at Stanford University, it was Sal Gureña at UC Santa Barbara, and the efforts of the Chicano Studies Research Center, Chonoriega and others that preceded him, of course, that have been, integral in acquiring and preserving these institutional histories, as well as working with the artists, right, to preserve those materials, right, and to catalog and then make them available for scholarship and research. And that has certainly increased. But what has not and did not, I don't think PST1 was particularly successful in influencing the collection of works of art by the artists, both historical and contemporary. So again, and I think it's one of the things I try to highlight in my paper as well, is that where the materials are, they're in archives, and they're in university archives largely. They are also in museum archives, including here at the GRI. There's some rich collections here, but they're not. It hasn't reached the institutional collecting of the artworks, and that's a concern for me long term. Right, because the materials need to be collected and need to be preserved, and not just the documentary materials, but the works of art themselves.
And do you think that might change with PST?
I'm not certain, because I think, and I don't, I think there's a small number of exhibitions that are focused on Chicano and Latino art. But there aren't as many exhibitions that are exploring the connection between Latin American and US Latina and Latino art. And I was hoping that more of the institutions would generate that type of curatorial projects and scholarship. So that's, to be perfectly honest, that's a disappointment for me, and I think for others as well.
Thank you so much for the two of you. That was very interesting and opening new perspectives. I have a question for you, Michele.
Yes.
When we talk about the birth of the museum in Latin America, we also have a lot of migrants' influence in the making of museums. Just one example, all the Jewish art movements that we had. So, and this is just one example. If I really look around, I will find much more. So, is the museum in Latin America just an issue about native anthropology, archaeology, and then somehow global art? Or have we also focused on very specific migrant, maybe not the right word, but with people that are a community by themselves, but that helped support to building up museums and galleries and art exhibitions in all Latin America?
So that's a fantastic question, and one that I'm not sure that I can answer, but because I feel like at least this project is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, it's really, I mean, so that what you just described about the institutions and the people, I mean, I think that's another direction in which we can go. I mean, I hope what this project does is then open up more possibilities, because there's no attempt to be encyclopedic in what we're doing at all, but instead it was trying to open up conversation. I mean, in similar ways that the symposium is doing, is to, you know, what are some of the themes, what are some of the issues, and so what you mentioned about, I mean, these groups and organizations, and I mean, I think that could be a whole other chapter and way of thinking about things. And what was really interesting too as we worked on this is, you know, we came up with one organization and we could entirely reorganize according to different themes and connections, because there were so many crossovers. And so there could, I mean, there was, you know, national, public versus private. There was, you know, the modern versus the early institutions. There were the ephemeral, you know, versus the more established. And so there were so many organizational principles. So I think that's one more thing that I need to add to our list of how we think about these institutions. I don't doesn't really answer the question, but it's something to add to the conversation, I guess.
Sir.
I actually wanted to thank you for reminding me of my youth, I guess. I happened to be, I was lucky enough to be one of the Chicano militants or movement leaders in the 60s and early 70s. And I remember being with Gronk when he would take over Whittier Boulevard and have a die-in for a Day of the Dead kind of thing and march to the cemetery. And then also on, I guess, self-help graphics, right in front of self-help graphics, the Brooklyn,
Right.
now Cesar Chavez, we take over the street, no permits, Aztec dancers, and we'd party for about an hour until the sheriffs came in, which is the occupying force because they're not a city. And then I go to Sacramento and party with Malaquías Montoya and Jose Montoya, who's an excellent poet. Well, he was an excellent poet. He just passed away a couple years ago. And I just happened to be at the opening of Los Cuatro, where they put that Chicano, actually Gilbert Lujan, Magus.
Right.
Imagine go to a museum and there's a lowrider as you walk in. That was the first exhibit item, and it's a beautifully painted Chicano mural on the car. Anyway, I can go on and on and on. So I just wanted to thank you for reliving that memory.
That's very nice. Thank you so much.
Other questions?
My question is for Ondine, and it's a follow-up on the former question about institutionalization. Mm-hmm. So we heard about the inspiration for Latin American museums being modeled after French museums. We heard today, we heard yesterday, all the French museum model. But thank you for talking about the Latino museum, because I think that is so important to insert into our discussion. And that inspiration had its origins very different, right? In very sort of anti-institutional groups and feelings, yet they became institutional.
Right.
So I'd like for you to talk a little bit about that paradox, a little bit about perhaps what was the institution for creating those museums, and then also in light of Cheech Marin's new center, right? Not a museum. He didn't call it a museum.
Right.
He called it a center for Chicano art, art history, industry. Thank you.
Right. I mean, I think the particular case studies that I highlighted in summary form, really where they're coming out of artist collectives that were intentionally. They were looking to institutionalize, but the model that they were using was the cultural center. Right, and particularly the social services organization. The social services were just as important to them, right? I mean, the visual arts and supporting artists and involving artists was part of a social service. And remember, during this time period, a lot of their funding was coming from CETA, right, the Comprehensive Educational and Training Act. So there were programs also about, training artists, providing opportunities for artists, and giving them some of that kind of professional experience, both in running institutions, but many of them were artist-run organizations. And conflicts soon did emerge, right? I mean, this happened with Lace. It started as a kind of a muralist workshop, with artists in El Monte on a kind of CETA grant. And Gronk and Roberto Gildemontes decided to do a mural of La Delita, and they gave her a gun. And the founders of El Monte said they hated murals and banned murals from El Monte, and so they could no longer be a mural workshop, so they became a gallery, right? They became an artist-run gallery in Los Angeles with the artists. They built out the space. They organized all the exhibitions, and yet that particular model wasn't sustainable. And as certain individuals became more administrators, right, and it became less of a collective, it started to break down, at least for the people that were involved in it in the beginning. And at that point, it also stopped having its kind of social commitments, right, and its commitments to supporting Chicano and Latino and Latin American art. There was this moment in 1978 and 1979 where Lace was this kind of really exciting, dynamic, robust place of locus or exchange for art and artists between Mexico largely, but Latin America and Los Angeles. So the process towards institutionalization, I think, has been different in every one. I do think that what Cheech is that model slightly different in the sense that it's a private collection, right? That's going from, and I may be mistaken, but I can't think of a similar model, right, within the Chicano Latino kind of museums, right, where it's generating out of a private collection. And from what I've heard today, it seems to follow maybe the model more of the Latin American museums that we've been talking about. But right, that's true, right, yeah. So I don't know if that answered it entirely, but it's in the direction of an answer, I hope.
Okay, this question is for both of you. I was wondering if you could comment on the, as far as within the US and Latin America in general, the impact of social activism on cultural identity and collective memory, just like in, institutions like in the museum and outside.
So that's a huge question. Okay. So I think the impact of social activism on these cultural institutions, and so I think it's one of these things that ebbs and flows. They're particular. What I found in the essays that we're looking at, there's certain historical moments, like the museum in Santiago, when there's a shift in government, or so it's either in correspondence with a governmental shift or a response to repression. And so the museums go underground or become itinerant or form these alternative models, like the last example I was talking about, the Museo de Barro or the Micromuseo, that are iterant specifically because of the political situation and because of the institutionalized attitude that they want to counteract. And so in terms of a historical trajectory, I think it's more moments and ebbs and flows and responses to political circumstances in particular case studies. But I thought I was interested in the resonance with my last couple of cases, especially from the 1970s, when we start to see like the 1970s and those case studies. There seemed to be a lot of resonance across North America and in Latin America with this foundation of these experimental spaces and centers and alternative ideas. And it almost becomes conceptual art in and of itself. The formation of that structure challenges the notion of the institution. And that happened across boundaries as well.
Absolutely. I do think we're at a precarious crossroads at this particular moment, and I don't want to go into great detail because I think it's so polarizing right now, but the situation with self-help graphics, right, which is a part of this history that I spoke of, is in a precarious situation right now. It comes out of social activism, right? It comes out of trying to meet the needs of the community, right? The joke was always, why do all the Chicanos like paint on the walls in East LA? Well, because there were no museums in East LA, right? There was a Vincent Price, and Vincent Price still does some of the best programming in the city. But I think right now there's social activism, right, that is intent on getting all cultural and art institutions out of Boyle Heights in East Los Angeles because they see them as part of a kind of gentrifying force, right? And I think, so it's, self-help graphic comes out of a history of social activism well over 40 years ago, and now it's the target of another form of social activism, right, that's anti-gentrification. But I do think that part of the ways in which the kind of anti-gentrification organizers have been able to rally such incredible support, and in principle I am against the gentrification, but is by effacing the very history of the institution and by calling it simply a gallery. Right, by identifying it simply as a gallery, I think they're able to say that it's be able to kind of rally or understand that it's simply a for-profit, right, and not understanding what the difference is, and potentially intentionally, right, eliding what the differences are between a commercial art gallery and a cultural institution, right, a cultural center and an art center.
So I think we have time for one last question before we hand it over. Ready to hand over? Oh yeah, Rafael, please.
Yeah, I was hoping to make a connection between your panel and the panel this morning, and it's around the issue of precariousness. And you're sitting under the image of the Museu de Arte Contemporânea in Niterói, and you were saying, Michele, in your talk about how this idea that the museum is not a building, the museum is a collection and a critical project. Of course, then you showed examples of museums that were buildings first, and first and foremost, like this one. So I'm wondering, we seem to have a specific problem in Latin America uniting the building, the collection, and the critical project. The three almost, I would say very few institutions have all three. So is that some sort of thing that we're fated to live with in our Latin identity?
We have to end positive.
I know. I think you might have just written part of my introduction to the book. I'll quote you on that. But no, that's actually really incredibly helpful too, because I feel there is a tension between, you said the building, the collection, and the critical project. And I don't know if I can think of any one case where all three are completely cohesive. And it's almost a utopian idea of the museum, and to bring those concepts together. But does it exist? Is it ideal? Or does one aspect always take precedence? Or is there a reason? I don't have an answer to your question, but I think it's a great framework for thinking about these museums and the founders and how they were, leaning toward, what was important in a particular moment. Was it the showy architecture? Was it, the cohesiveness of the collection, or what the collection stood for in terms of perhaps ideology or politics, or was it a critical curatorial project? And can all those things go together? what do you want to add? It's not an answer, but I think it's a great way of framing these, and coming to synthesis for what all the talks over the last 2 days.
Well, and it seems to me like the way to move forward is to study the three in tandem. I mean, to really not ignore, I mean, they exist in some configuration, maybe different from what's expected or what one is used to in every project. And so I think thinking about it through mail art is a really interesting way to get away from the building, but not ignore the space or the site. And I think that this is really important work because it hasn't been done. And so this is sort of foundational, and then we can move into the more kind of case study, you know, something like migrant and how they affected the configuration of those three entities. Okay, well, thank you everyone for staying. We're moving forward with closing remarks, right, by Miguel Angel Fernandez. And then after that, we will be having a reception outside. And so I hope everyone can stay for that as well.
Thank you.
So Miguel Angel Fernandez, and probably no better person to be able to wrap this up and tie it all neatly with a look for the future and visions of the next phase of museum. So I'll
do it quickly.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. I only have 15 minutes, so it will take a miracle. But please, Kim and Jennifer, you can make a sign so I will disappear when the time comes. I was thinking now, how should I call this final reflection? And I will call it the value of research as a personal museum experience. We are in a research center. And I'll go back about 2,000 years before what we heard now. When I came young to Mexico, and they appointed me general national coordinator of museums. I was terrified. I said, well, I am in a foreign country. I'm very young. What do I do now? More than 100 museums, big ones, small ones. And I said, I have to do research. I have to learn about what happened, where did they come from, so many museums. Different regions, different cultures. And so by day, I made exhibits and create museums, and by night at home, I did research. And I discovered that you don't have to be a scholar to use and to appreciate the value of research. I survived thanks to those nights. And I must excuse myself to use personal books, but this is the product of how I learned my business in museums, and this is the way I do it. First of all, this is the first book. It's about more than 40 years ago. And I made inventories, I searched for information, and little by little, let me go with this, begin. I began to put order into antecedents of museums that we didn't know much about them. I tried to go very quick. Different regions, it says, I don't know, I can read it from here, but you can see the Museum Nacional, well, the important dates, the image of the national museums, where it was, the paintings, the publications, 1825, 1827, the Mexican shows in London in 1825. This is supposed to be the two first modern museographical shows made in the Egyptian Hall in London. And also San Carlos. At the same time, a bit later, I was also nominated, appointed General Curator of the Academia San Carlos. And here again, I changed from anthropology and archaeology to the arts, but I had to write the inventories of the academy and the bicentennials, and go through all these beautiful 18th century and 19th century collections. You see the paintings. Students used to come when they were 11 years old. Diego Rivera passed through also through here. And then years afterwards, in the year 2000, I published this tribute to the private collectors. I knew already museums, so I have to get into this other world. I also tracked down the collections, the collectors. These are the inventories of the Seller family, Cecile, as Viola told me the other day, and Eduardo Seller. Beautiful. The collections everywhere in the country, these are from the West. Collections inside collections, the Viceregal furniture. Collections of people, the Moctezuma genealogy, the genealogical trees of the Viceregal times, libraries, paintings on glass on Mexican libraries in the 18th century, the country of silver, so many collections, and then also the bicentennial. I was at the National Palace on the bicentennial of the country. This is a big catalog. It was 5,000 square meters of show. It was a lot of work. We had to create the National Gallery also. And of course, the old collections again. You have there the throne of the first emperor, and Iturbide, and we had to restore it. We show it for the first time. Well, I did have to work for many years. The university. This is the catalog. You have to remember that the first National Museum was at the university, exactly in those two floors over here and in the patio. And this is the catalog of that exhibit that had 2,400 pieces. We managed to create the 13 cabinets from the 18th century and 19th century. And well, this is also the result of all that. Astrolabs, libraries, it goes from the 16th century to the 19th century. And this is a final example of my catalogs. This was also an immense show in Monterrey, and it was called Isis and the Feather Serpents. The idea was to compare, well, the real idea is that I wanted to have a relationship with Egypt. We are the pyramids countries. Without going through Europe or the United States, we could deal, and more or less it worked. And then also we wanted to show that we also have small archaeological pieces, but we also have the pharaonic scale in Mexico. And we also have pieces that go back 1500 before Christ. So it was interesting, and we chose the two patrons of the arts, Isis and Quetzalcoatl. And this is the final photograph. This is Osiris at the left, and that is the feather serpent related to the feather serpent in Mexico. It looks quite Egyptian too. This was a time when diffusionism lived in the 19th century, and many people living in Mexico and in Europe said that the cities in Mexico, in pre-Hispanic Mexico, and the pyramids could not be built by Indians, that it had to be the lost tribe of Israel, it had to be Egypt, and so we compared this immense, we have about 300 pieces of Mexican things. You go to a pyramid, and then you pass to ancient Egypt. And it was an interesting show, and a way to get to the Arab countries, comparing what this happened in Mexico. This really was happening. When Napoleon left, lost the Egyptian campaign, some archaeologists that were in Egypt then, Waldeck, and then afterward Catherwood, Stevens, imbued with the Romantic period, they came to Mexico to do archaeology. They knew that big things were appearing. So during the whole 19th century, from the first decade to the last, Mexico was called by many authors the American Egypt. And this is going back to that period, to the 19th century, to go contrary to all this diffusionism theory. Okay. And now we go to another experience of mine. Once I became independent from the government. The government of Puebla called me because they realized that Mexicans knew about pre-Hispanic world, they knew about contemporary art, about independence, but no one almost knew what Baroque was. So Mexico wanted to have a Baroque. We had 200 years of Baroque. And as a matter of fact, we didn't have also an international museum. So this was a moment of something I was waiting for. that what we wanted to do is to make different museums than what we did last century. What we did in the 20th century was okay, but it doesn't work now anymore. We are looking for new formats, models of museums, for new paradigms, and this will be an example. The museum, the International Baroque Museum, is not a museum of collections. Of course, it has a patrimony, but it is a place of encounter and a place to know, let to know the international community that they have a home here for the Baroque. And Puebla is a Baroque city. It's the only city in Mexico done for the Spaniards in the 16th century that didn't have a job. This is a Baroque temple on the top of a pyramid, of the widest pyramid in the world. Egypt has the tallest, we have the widest in brick, and then you have the volcanoes around in the city. You have the cathedral, it's Renaissance in the front, it's Baroque in the back. The first public library in Mexico and probably in America. 17th century public library open to Puebla, and it's intact. Baroque houses for civil purposes, and ultra Baroque. Okay, this is just to give you an idea. Now, we wanted this international museum not to compete with the historical Baroque. So we thought doing a museum in a very modern, contemporary section outside of downtown, because we just want to explain and interpret. We don't want to compete, and for many of the reasons though. And this is the result. Oh, well, this is the Jesuits in also Baroque in Puebla. And this is the museum now. For a long time, we had to discuss for months with the Japanese architect that it cannot be a glass museum, like sometimes it does. And it couldn't be straight because Baroque is movement, is a curve, is life. It has to move. So after finally many meetings, we got to this result that I think it isn't too bad. This is the museum. And the Ultra Baroque. We did for this museum more than 5,000 museum design plans. We did more design plans than the architectural part did. We really, and this is what I call a personal experience of research. I always think that before doing a project, you have to connect. You have to think, you have to reflect. So we even made, well, I even coordinated a printed project. It says, what is our proposal museologically, museographically, and how should it be done before spending money in doing a museum of this type. And I will quickly, these are curators, design plans. My theory about the essence of museums is change, but with continuity. And how should we proceed producing? You will see there very big projections. You have a mapping, 10 meter tall, from an Ecuadorian church. The construction of the building. The Wunderkammer, Chambre Merveille. We did this with what was left from the collections. We did this in 4 days. The big auditorium, the first one, we went to film to Europe, the Baroque vaults in Europe for the origin of the Baroque, and we projected on the top and also on 3 immense screens also. Some of the halls were we call living halls. Additionally, they have pieces. They also had scenarios, so you can read Baroque poetry at certain times. You can have Baroque theater at a certain time if you wanted to. And then you can see the designs on the floor. This is a show about the Manila Galleon, the China Galleon. Extremely important. We had 250 years of commerce with China during the Baroque period. But look at the size of the halls. This is the biggest temporary hall in Mexico. It's bigger than the National Museum of Anthropology. Of course, to get to Mexico from China, you needed to know all these nautical instruments. still more of the design of the, and also our designs are mapping, more mapping, how you can explain from the Renaissance to the Baroque. The Liechtenstein, the Principality of Liechtenstein, lent us for 10 years. They have an immense, it's the biggest private collection of Baroque in the world. They lent us these Venetian 17th century paintings. And well, they were very generous, and we restored it. They brought the Metropolitan restorers, and we put them into place. They were made by Antonio Bellucci in Venice. We used a lot of technology. It's a very didactic museum. And you see, you have all these computers that explain Baroque to you. We have labels, we have more scenarios. You can see the design we make and the curve to have those big walls that are in 4 Indian languages. We have a big German community in Puebla. It's in German, it's in French, in Spanish, and in English. Doesn't move. There we go. But the maquette. One of the instruments of the Baroque artists 300 years ago were the monumental maquettes. We had one in Puebla, and also we have the Neo-Baroque. There are expressions of Baroque nowadays. We also try to show that India, for example, is very Neo-Baroque in that. And we are going back to Puebla, to the Baroque. And 1 minute for explaining to you how we constructed the museum, and then we end over there, 15 minutes. Toyo Ito, the architect, while he was working with us, he won the Pritzker Prize that year. So this is part of the surprises we had in the project. The construction system is quite unique also. Every piece of the walls is different and it moves. So it's curved on the outside, but it's straight in the inside. Okay, well, all this is just to tell you that the purpose we're here, for example, is that this year, for example, I wrote an article in a book about William Belloc, a British man who was extremely important to Mexican museography. And the original engravings of the beginning of the 19th century of William Belloc are here, and his catalogs are here. So this is the beauty of all this, that we need to be together, we need the dialogue, we need to exchange, and all this is possible if we add up between ourselves. I thank you again for your patience, as I always say, and I just wanted to tell you an example of what we have to do. We don't have too many curators, so we have to do 16th century museography, and we try to adapt and we search for another formats of museums that we need so much. That's all. Thank you so much.